Good evening, everyone. This is Abhivadan from Internationalism, and here we are for a very interesting episode of Global Hint, episode 7, season 2. In the past episodes, we have discussed about the risk impacts when it comes to geopolitics. We have discussed the Indo-Pacific comprehensively with Ms. Velina Chokorova, Dr. Robert Lyman, and even Ms. Dr. Sumantra Metra. Now, the Indo-Pacific is not limited, we know, to the maritime portions. Of course, it's not just about the Strait of Malacca or the Pacific Ocean, the Solomon Islands, and so forth. The landlocked countries also have a very important role to play. One of the landlocked countries, which is unfortunately in a very worse situation right now from a humanitarian perspective, and of course from a security perspective, is Afghanistan, which the Taliban calls the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, IEA. So, in this discussion on Afghanistan, in this esteemed panel, we have an intention to indulge into a discussion where we have sane debates, disagreements, as well as agreements on the very specific issues that are related to the geopolitical constructs and divergences that have caused after the American troops withdrew from Afghanistan, and what are the true implications from the perspectives of the American government, the Taliban. How does it affect India? How does it affect the rest of the portions in Central Asia? Because there are many hypes around, as well as there are many things which are being ignored single-handedly. So, with this, I would like to introduce this illustrious panel. Uh, we had 6 panelists. We are still waiting for one of great panelists still, but I would like to introduce this illustrious panel. We have, uh, I would say, I would introduce Mr. Patrick Mercer. So, Colonel Patrick Mercer is a British author. He is a former politician from UK. He was a conservative shadow Homeland Security spokesman uh, and he was a member of Parliament for New York in the UK Parliament uh, from 7 June 2001 to 30th April 2014. We also have Mr. Dattesh Prabhu Parulekar. He is associated with the School of International and Area Studies, Goa University. He's an assistant professor and also director for the International Relations Center there. He's also a visiting faculty at the Naval War College, INS Mandovi, Goa. And he's also an advisory of the Academic Council India Studies Program and State University of Rio de Janeiro. We also have Shanti Maria D'Souza. She is the founder and president of Mantra, and she is also the founding professor of the Cordelia School of Public Policy. And along with this, we have 2 important young scholars. I would say one of them is a geek, one of them is a scholar. We have Rishabh Vats, who is a visiting professor at NMIMS Mumbai. And I would say we have Shaunak Agarkhedkar. He is an author, he is an AI geek, and he is much interested in defense-related issues and strategic issues. You can follow his blog, which is on strategic and defense issues. He has recently written on the Panchshir Doctrine, so you can read about basically the Panchshir Protocol or the Panchshir Doctrine, if I'm right. So, as we will proceed with this discussion, the very basic intent is to declutter some of the important aspects related to Afghanistan, the strategic problems, and how they should be understood from a larger perspective. So, my very basic question to all the panelists, and this will happen in a clockwise manner, but I would request Patrick to Mr. Patrick to begin first, is that as the situation has unfolded, the basic assumption which has been is that the general aspects of constructivism and the rules-based international order, so as told, is being highly affected, especially to the detriment of the Western powers, basically European Union countries and the other American NATO allies such as US and Canada. So, considering the Afghan situation from an army point of view, from a defense point of view, I'd like to know views from all, of course, from Colonel Patrick from this. But after Colonel Patrick, I would like to know views from all the panelists in the clockwise manner. So, Colonel Patrick, first, welcome to Global Hint. Please express your views, and then, of course, panelists in a clockwise manner from Datesh ji to Shaunak to Rishabh to Shanti ji can express further. So, Colonel Patrick, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to join you. Can I make a correction, first of all, please? This is, from a Western point of view, this is not purely an American issue. This is an allied issue. And I think if I may correct this is something that affects all of the West very deeply. From a purely British perspective, of course, we have a long history of fighting against and with Afghan forces. This is our fifth major engagement inside Afghanistan, and unquestionably, this has been a defeat. Therefore, the new order that we're looking at must, of course, reflect Britain's minority partnership along with the rest of the Allies, and the new order that we look at in terms of the security situation being extremely fragile, extremely dangerous, and new players coming into the equation, not just places like Iran and Russia, who have been involved in this since time immemorial, but of course the Leviathan of China.
Dateshji, would you like to have some views?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm audible to everyone. Yeah, thank you. I'll just broaden this argument that, Right Honorable Mr. Mercer said, and I'll say this is basically an indictment of democracies around the world. I think what has happened really in Afghanistan is, I think, unprecedented in world affairs, because what you see is, in the form of the United States and the larger West, we have legitimized the takeover by a terrorist outfit of a country through what we are calling a negotiated settlement. Even though there was a negotiated process that was underway in Doha, by the time things played out, it pretty much was neither that negotiated settlement, nor was it the terms on which a negotiation was to take place. And yet today we are discussing about how to legitimize the Taliban and how to legitimize the new government in Afghanistan for the sake of the Afghan people, which in effect is a terrorist outfit that has taken power in a kind of a coup that has almost been legalized. And so this, I think, is a very big salutary indictment for democracies going around. And it's going to be a huge issue in the reputation that democracies can stabilize and pacify countries and bring them out of their war-torn status into a certain degree of stability. So I'll stop there by just making it a point about democracies and what democracies can do in such hotbeds around the world.
Shaunak, yes.
Yeah, thank you for having me. In addition to what Professor Parlekar said, it's also history coming full circle in a way. In less than 3 decades, the same group of extremists, supported by the same quasi-rogue state, have taken over the same country under similar circumstances, and the parallels are immense. So it really is, a huge question mark on the credibility of, the Americans, for starters, but democracies around the world. If this happens twice in the span of a generation, then there's definitely something that needs to be fixed in the global order if you're to prevent humanitarian catastrophes like this. Thank you.
Rishabh, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I'm audible. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thank you, Abhinandan, for inviting me. I think I will concur with most of what was said by my fellow panelist before. I also think that much more than just this being just an indictment of democracy, I think this is a big indictment of the whole liberal international world order, right? What we are framing today as a rule-based order or a quest for rules-based order, fighting against the very aggressive and often very antagonistic powers, not just in Asia but elsewhere. I think it's a big indictment of not just these countries or the systems that we have, but also institutions like the UN, for example, right? And yeah, there are a lot of historical parallels, and maybe we'll go into them further down the road. But as Mr. Patrick said before, this is not entirely an American issue or even a European issue. This actually affects everything. Especially, for example, South Asia is a region where the whole development here is it's basically upended the whole security architecture of the region. And you see, for example, maybe not directly due to developments in Afghanistan, but you see, for example, how there are things that turning out or changing very fast in the region and beyond, especially in Eurasia as well, right? So from China to Russia to Central Asian countries to countries like India and others, you see there is some sort of a crystallization that's happening. And that's very interesting that we've all, especially in India, of course, have to, look at. For some of us, especially in the subcontinent, this is not just an issue of values, etc., but also this represents an eminent threat, right, to our region, to our interest. And yeah, so in that sense, I think this is something which is something which is going to be a challenge for the global community at large. Thank you.
Certainly. Shantiji, you can express your views, and then, of course, we can go to the historical perspective on the Afghanistan issue.
Well, I think I have a slightly different view from what the panelists have been talking about, either in the sense of the democratic argument or the rules-based order. I would actually like to provide a critique of the nature of the international intervention in Afghanistan, wherein this whole exercise of having democracy there itself has failed, and therein raises the fundamental question of whether the societies are ready for democracy, one. Second, about the nature of democracies these societies should have, because these are traditional societies who had their own structures of democracies and are being trying to be imposed by a Western notion of democracy, which actually fundamentally failed. Second is to look at the nature of the military intervention. I mean, it's rightly pointed out that it's been an allied operation. There were more than 56 countries involved, but none of them had actually a unified vision or an end vision in mind of what they wanted to see Afghanistan in 10, 20 years from 2001 till now. And thereby, I think the fundamental problem lies in the nature of the international intervention, both on the military and economic, and also about this idea of democracy, which we are trying to implement in very traditional societies. So having said that, when you look at the issues of long-term stabilization of countries like Afghanistan, which have been conflict-prone for more than 4 decades, I think we have failed to understand the nature of the society, the kind of leadership it required, the kind of basic services it actually needed to be delivered to the people, and more importantly, the responsibility of the international community, where so many countries were involved in different ways but could not deliver. So I think the debate should focus on all areas where we have actually missed opportunities in Afghanistan, and the writing has been on the wall for some time. The negotiated settlement has rightly been pointed out as brought out a terrorist group to capture power, and this is again a repeat of what happened in the 1990s. So we do have issues in terms of understanding Afghanistan, and more importantly, of understanding what it means to intervene in countries where we are trying to bring in peace and stability, when actually there's a larger geopolitical game at play. I think I'll stop there with these remarks and maybe take on more as we go along. Thank you.
Definitely. So, as we have Right Honorable Patrick Mercer, and as we have to understand the historical grasp, not just for the discussion, but also for the viewers who are watching us and who will be watching this session. Um, so, Afghanistan has been subjected to intervention by three powers: the British, the Soviet, that is the Russians, and the Americans. So, if I may request Colonel Patrick to give an insight on the British incursions into Afghanistan, and how have the allied countries dealt when it comes to the simple aspects of incursions and occupation as compared to the Soviet ones. And as we go along in the line, how has the American one been so far after the British and the Soviet ones? So if Colonel Patrick would like to shed his views, please.
Yeah, of course. And thank you very much for this opportunity. And thank you to all my panelists for views in the introduction, which I found extremely stimulating. Now, please forgive me if I start from a British perspective. Now, British colonial perspective, because so much of the modern history of Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan has been dictated by the events of the early and the middle part of the 19th century, when, of course, Britain was the colonial power. So clearly, there's a history that goes long before the British arrived anywhere near here. But twice in the 19th century, and once in the early part of the 20th century, there were British expeditions across the northwest frontier and other parts of the frontier between India and Afghanistan into the country of which we would now call Afghanistan. All three of those expeditions, 1839 to 1842, 1878 to 1880, and 1919, were successes. Now, that is purely and simply said from a British colonial point of view, but they were incursions, or in the event of, in the case of 1919, the throwing back of an Afghan invasion of British India, and subsequently a pursuit into Afghanistan, where the imperative was met by the British government, despite the very heavy casualties at places like Gandamak in the 1840s and Maiwand in the 1880s. Despite these tactical setbacks, the British strategic and political aspects were met. They were successes, despite the bloodshed. Missing out the Soviets for a moment, the latest incursion, the latest attempt to aid by the Afghanistan, which starts clearly in 2001 and has lasted for 20 years, has been an unmitigated failure. We've already had pointed out by other members on the panel that twice inside a few decades, the Afghan nationals, with support from their allies, have succeeded in defeating sophisticated, allegedly sophisticated, largely Western powers. And I think the lesson that comes from this is don't look back into British Imperial India to try and gain lessons from this, because there are very few to be gained. Look back, however, to the Soviet attempt to invade. That's the point. The Imperial British tried incursions and they worked. The Soviets tried to invade and it didn't work. Guess what? We copied the example of something, the Western allies copied the example of something which had hideously and dramatically failed, namely the Soviet incursion. Now, the Soviets militarily probably succeeded, but politically, socially, and internationally, they were defeated. The difference over the past 2 decades is that militarily, the Allies have similarly been defeated. Politically, socially, and internationally, again, they have been defeated. Why? Because Western attempts at democracy to try and impose a military solution simply don't work. When political correctness, wokery, whatever phrases you want me to use, when they come head to head with a determined resistance, not just from the Afghans, but also with aided, supplied, abetted, and directed, certainly by Pakistan, and to an extent by China, and to a degree to Russia, then the Western alliance based on democracy has failed, and failed signally.
I must say that is really an interesting analysis to start with when it comes to the historical aspects of Afghanistan. So I'd like to connect it like a follow-up to Shaunak. So Shaunak, as we see the Soviet invasions into Afghanistan, let us say like that, how would you compare the Soviet troop levels as to the US troop levels when it comes to the Durand Line, and seeing the two occupations in their own way? So if you give a comparative analysis on that, following up to what Colonel Patrick has said, what do you think? I think you are on mute. No,
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Right. So let's start with troop levels, because that's the most obvious indicator of how seriously any military activity is being taken. The Soviets had 115,000 troops at their peak. in Afghanistan, and that number was roughly stable throughout the decade or so that they were in the country. The United States only approached those levels, and I'm sorry, I'm calling it out. I'm calling the US out separately. It is an allied effort, yes, but uh, unfortunately, it so happens there were multiple chains of command. There were different agendas in play. It's just convenience. So the Allies had the US approached those levels only in 2010 and 2011. Uh, Between 2002 and 2020, they averaged between 30 and 40,000 troops in the entirety of Afghanistan. Clearly not enough. If I may take a few minutes of your time, a few friends and I, we tried to map the Indian Army's experience along the line of control in Jammu and Kashmir with the Durand Line, because in both situations you had a democracy or a quasi-democracy facing infiltration from the same state across the frontier. And if you consider the part above Miran Shah or Wana, all the way up to Chitral and the Wakhan corridor, uh, the terrain is roughly similar. It's slightly more harsh along the LOC, but you can approximate it. Now, along the LOC, considering the infiltration from Pakistan, the Indian Army has roughly one battalion every 10 kilometers. That's a yardstick that you can apply. If you if you measure the Durand line from Wana all the way up to the Wakhan corridor, that's roughly 850 kilometers. To secure that frontier from a counter infiltration perspective would have required between 50,000 to 85,000 troops along that frontier. We're not even talking about a counterinsurgency grid in the interiors. If you include that, you would rapidly approach 200,000 to 250,000 troops, which is roughly half the regular US Army. And clearly, neither the US nor any of the allies had the appetite to commit that level of troops into Afghanistan, especially since the invasion of Iraq began a few years later, roughly a year later. So it was inadequate, and with Pakistan realizing that the Americans were not very serious, they were distracted with Iraq. They seized the opportunity starting 2003 to resume support to the Taliban. Initially, it was very shady, under the table sort of a thing. But as time went by, they became emboldened, and we all see the result. Thanks.
So I would like to ask a question to Shantiji, because if you look at her works in IDSA and other organizations, she has very well worked on the political developments in Afghanistan from a perspective of, how India and US have contributed to the political quotient of it. So this question is to Shantiji as well as Datesh sir, both of you, and then Rishabh can follow up on this. So Shantiji can answer first, and then Datesh sir can proceed with it. So we know that the credibility of the political elite in Afghanistan was, of course, not on a good way. And after this withdrawal, Ashraf Ghani has lost his credibility a lot. In fact, after even writing a statement in the media, in the public, that fine, I left it and I feel guilty and all of that stuff, their basic credibility is completely devastated. Now, is it whenever it is stated from a historical point of view, now we see that fine, India, people say invested, India doesn't recognize it, invested in Afghanistan. India did basically say it's kind of a charitable activity there for the support of the Afghan people, as they stated. Do we see, and you have even pointed out in your previous works, that mostly the work in Afghanistan has been symbolic. So as we see these developments per se, do we can we say that symbolism has not much gone into the practical fora? Has it not translated into practicality when it comes to India's own avenues in Afghanistan? Because from a security point of view, it does affect India indirectly. And can the same be said for the allied countries, especially the US? So You can give your views, and of course, then the Tesh sir can continue from there.
Well, I think it's interesting and important that you brought out this point about Indian projects and Indian development assistance in Afghanistan. And as you stated, it's symbolic in lot many ways. But having said that, India has pledged more than 3 billion US dollars in Afghanistan from 2001 till now, and it's one of the largest recipients of India's aid. It's also a country in which India has first signed its agreement on strategic partnership agreement. And also Afghanistan has signed the first agreement on a strategic partnership with India. So there's lots beyond symbolism in terms of the content of the relationship. So when I did write about symbolism, I was actually talking about the fact that most of India's aid has generated a lot of goodwill because these projects were delivered through the Afghans based on Afghan needs and had more impact than the Western aid. But the problem with the soft power approach, which India used vis-a-vis the military approach of the West, was that it was not really translated into hard-term gains. So if I have to say it in very simple terms, if you look at provinces where the small-scale projects were delivered, there was a lot of goodwill there, but over time, because of lack of institutions in the Afghan government or on the Afghan state building exercise itself, these projects ended up to be more like islands of success. And these projects did not get integrated into the basic Afghan state building exercise. So therein, it ended up to be more as symbols rather than substance. But if you look at what India did in terms of building the parliament, which was again very symbolic because it didn't do much in terms of the political transition as things were turning in Afghanistan towards the other side, India just ended up being an observer to the events as they unfolded. And therein, I think there's the limitation of what we did. We went for this large scale projects like the parliament, we did the road, we built the road in Zaranj, which was, in terms of trade, you really don't know how much trade actually occurred. And according to reports from the field, most of it was used by the Taliban. And likewise with dam, the Salma Dam, which is seen as India-Afghan Friendship Dam, these were good projects. They didn't translate in actually reviving or rebuilding the state institutions which was required. Now you have two fundamental arguments here. The Western way of doing things was very different from Indian way of doing things. The West actually gave money to most of its contractors and subcontractors and did not give it through the Afghan government because they had two fundamental reasons or arguments against it, in which they said either the Afghans lacked the capacity or the Afghans were corrupt. So they ended up doing most of their things themselves. In a way, this led to a scenario where you had parallel institutions of governance, and this, in a way, impacted on the Afghan government's capacity and credibility, and there was no effort to build institutions where long-term gains could have been sustained. India, on the other hand, gave money based on Afghan needs and priorities, and most of it was very well received. So, if you see the polls, there was a lot of acceptance of India's aid. But in terms of accountability of where did the money reach, how much impact it made, again, we had a gap out there. But more importantly, my problem with the way India did the development assistance was in terms of institution building, be it in the security sector, where the Afghans came to India a number of times asking for a lot of help, but India did not get into that military sphere because one, the reason of actually raising the ante for Pakistan, second, to be a party in the conflict, and third is India had its own domestic compulsions that it didn't want to get involved in an external theater where it would have been dragged endlessly. In the political sphere, again, I think India could have made contributions, but it shied away from it because it didn't want to get into the local politics, which was very messy, especially when the presidential elections unfolded in 2009, 2014, 2019. These were fraud-marked elections, which impacted the legitimacy of the state. And here again, India stayed away and did nothing much about it. Likewise, with the peace processes which were initiated in Doha, again, India stayed out of it mostly because it was given to understand that the US would make certain agreements with India on certain level, but that didn't really work out the way it should have the way what we saw on August 15 when President Ghani actually fled the country and there was a total political collapse. And more importantly, on the economic sector, where I think Afghanistan had tremendous potential to build its own indigenous economy and have its own sources of revenue. Again, it wasn't one of the concerns for India in the sense of generating that revenue. So India gave a lot of money, and that money, we are not sure how much impact it made and how do we translate that money into into the hard term gains. So what India got in the long term was goodwill, but the fundamental question is how do you actually translate goodwill into hard term gains, and that was the question we faced up for few years, and then we came across a blank wall, and then India had to flee Afghanistan or leave Afghanistan as things turned very dramatically downside. So that is the rationale I have when I'm talking about symbolism. It's not that India did not do good work in Afghanistan. It's the way it did it and way it looked in the long-term stabilization. And the problem there is actually in Delhi, and it's not about the diplomats who are working in the field who do a lot of good work there. It's just a lack of a long-term vision of what you want to do in a country you're intervening or involved in terms of development assistance, and what you see as an end state. So fundamentally, it is coming to the same argument of what you look at international community's role of looking at an end state in Afghanistan, that how do you see Afghanistan 10 or 20 years from now? How do you look at countering insurgencies, which take much more longer time? How do you look at stabilizing conflict-prone societies, which need more than military intervention, but more on the political and economic sectors, and more importantly, on the institution building? So I think these are broadly my views and taken much of your time, but yeah, I would like to pass it on. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I think it's a very detailed assessment, I must say. So, as the Tiji responds to this in his own way, I just have a follow-up question to add for him specifically on this. So, yes, let us say that we developed our strategic vision towards Pakistan, China, and Afghanistan in our own way. Afghanistan is again intelligence. There is a division when it comes to the intelligence information. Later, it was stated that it was not predicted enough by I think the U.S. intelligence agencies that the withdrawal would cause so much ramifications. But later out, I think later on, then ABC News reported, if I remember, that no, the intelligence agencies had one another alternative understanding that yes, this could have happened. So let us take that into perspective for a while. I'm only saying from a perspective of cooperation. Uh, there is no doubt that the current government is, of course, the Modi government is, of course, focusing on enhancing its strategic view in the Indo-Pacific and, of course, the erstwhile landlocked South Asian region. On this, how much loss quotient we have considering the volatility of the situation in Afghanistan, and how are we charting the way forward? Of course, it will be slow, but how much slow or fast, or how much consistent could it be considered? So, Datishji, now you can respond.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just make a few points before I get to the specific question that you have raised. Just if you look back at all the countries that have really made a developmental pitch in Afghanistan in their own little way, the problem has been that the entire effort has been disjointed. So while you've had a lot of money put into development, you've thrown a lot of money and projects in there, it doesn't really contribute towards consolidating the democratic structure, the institutional framework within Afghanistan. And actually, if you look very closely geopolitically, this is one of the areas where I guess India casting its lot with the United States, in retrospect, probably has cost India quite dearly. Because this is one of those subsets, geographical subsets in the world, where the United States was unpopular from the very outset. I mean, just look at Afghanistan and all its neighbors and its extended neighbors. Really, there is no one that really advocates a cause for the United States being in that part of the world. All the Central Asian republics have been running scared of the United States because they have been fearful of the United States trying to insert and impose democracy in these regimes. The Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese couldn't wait to see the Americans go out. Pakistan played its own running with the hare and hunting with the hound, where it used American money essentially to fuel American debts. And even extended allies of the United States never saw the United States as a desirable force in the region. Willy-nilly, by us putting our eggs into the American basket, as was presented now, including with the Doha process, we also in many ways lost the ability to balance our foreign policy in the region. In fact, I see a very interesting irony. In the lead up to Kabul falling to the Taliban, all along India was, as was mentioned, India was really a notional presence when it came to the intra-Afghan dialogue and also the larger process in Doha. But ever since Kabul has fallen and Taliban has taken power, suddenly India has emerged at the diplomatic center stage. If you see over the last 15, 20, 25 days, the kind of intense negotiations, discussions, conversations going on in various world capitals, and the manner in which India has been involved in every possible conversation, whether it's our conversations with Iran, where you had Jaishankar meet, Raisi as many as 4 times. You had conversations between India and Russia at a very high level. You're having India having discussions with the European Union and Slovenia. This probably India needed to have all along. But the problem was, because India was so much, kind of enthralled with the US approach, the US unpopularity in the region also in a sense was a blowback to India. And this caused India to basically sit on the sidelines. Of course, we have to keep in mind that ever since 2010-11, when India really pivoted in an inflection point in its foreign policy, moving essentially into becoming a global development partner through its donor aid, quite clearly Afghanistan has been that one country that has been iconic in terms of the extent of involvement. If you see India's involvement in Africa, India's involvement in the South Pacific, and probably India's involvement in Afghanistan, and you kind of look at the aid that they have dispensed out over the last 10, 11 years, clearly Afghanistan stands out. But this risk averse, tendency that we have in our foreign policy, where we are always looking for easy choices. I mean, one of the things the Americans are now throwing back at us, right or wrong, the Americans are throwing back at us, is if you were so concerned about Afghanistan, you should have also put your, troops on the line. You should have also been out there, being able to fight it. So that argument kind of cuts both ways. Do you want the Americans just to pay with their lives as you take the, the easy moral high ground of doing soft sector projects? So, this kind of disjointed, discussion continues. I think also where we have erred is in India not being able to strike partnerships in the context of Afghanistan with certain key countries who have a good track record at development partnership. For example, Japan. I mean, Japan and Central Asia has a Japan Central Asia plus dialogue. But probably given that India and Japan have been looking to structure a larger, infrastructure and connectivity enterprise in the Indo-Pacific, if they had been able to factor in Afghanistan as one of the key elements, then they might have been able to deliver better projects on the ground, which might have given them better traction than the kind of soft sector, projects that we have done that don't give us any kind of tangible aid. Our problem going forward, I think, is going to be what I call as the troika. And I think this troika, we will have to keep in mind, is really going to be the spanner in the works as far as India's Afghanistan policy is going to be. And the three countries essentially are China, Pakistan, and Turkey. Because it's very clear that one of the countries which has made strategic inroads over the course of the last decade, quite kind of progressively, has been Turkey. In fact, it has been able to occupy various parts of the strategic vacuum, both using the United States, its ally, and also exploiting the United States retreat. Because if you see the entire movement from 2011 till 2021, the one country that has been able to engage the Taliban, so much so that even President Biden earlier this year was actually in favor of Taliban being negotiating with the Taliban through Turkey. And that got India into greater trouble because given our strained relations with Turkey, we all of a sudden had to now start to remodulate our relationship with Turkey because we felt that America was now putting its lot with Erdogan and Turkey. So Turkey, Pakistan, and China are going to obviously work together, maybe not collectively, but even individually, to see that India's presence in Afghanistan does not become stronger, does not become deeper. But our only hope is going to be to what extent we can rebalance our foreign policy in the region, obviously not putting all our eggs in the American basket, crafting a regional strategic approach that involves Central Asian countries. And I think this is where I probably believe that a foreign minister dialogue between India and Central Asia needs to happen quickly, where India also makes it clear to the region that we are part of a regional approach. And obviously Russia would be a very key player. So the Russia, India, Central Asia, kind of a regional architecture would be very important in terms of India being able to remain relevant in Afghanistan from a strategic point of view. Thank you.
So we can say that maybe RICA, RICA, could be hoped in future and should happen, as the Tejji suggests. So, Rishabh, what is your take on you know, the I would say the analysis by both of the panelists? So, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I largely agree with both D'Souza ma'am and Datesha. One thing I would, of course, like to point out that it can, of course, India can be put at fault for many things, right? We, of course, pride ourselves in what we did in Afghanistan, the developmental aid, the projects, etc. And yes, there is an argument to be made that yeah, although we had or generated a lot of goodwill, ultimately there was a lack of political leverage to some extent. And a lot of people have argued that maybe we could have diversified our dialogue with different ethnic or tribal groups. But I would just like to point out that despite all the things that were said by the panelists before, I would say that ultimately on the political level, India did not, I think, have the pull to some extent to actually go ahead and have any effect in terms of what was happening in Kabul and elsewhere. India, of course, you can call it risk averse as well. But to some extent, I would say that yes, there was not much we can do basically. And even now, for example, now that we are having a debate or a discussion about whether we should engage with the Taliban, how much that engagement should be, I think there have been a lot of people who've been giving out counterfactuals, suggesting that if only India had engaged with Taliban a few years earlier, things would have been different, or we would have had at least a little bit more influence. I don't think that necessarily true, because we know, for example, that the reason why the Pakistani establishment has a lot of leverage or influence over different factions of the Taliban, etc., and other groups there is not just because of their support, which, by the way, goes back decades. So it's not just them providing centuries, military support, etc., etc. It's also, to do with tribal and religious affiliations and, a certain understanding. So, to that extent, I would say definitely. I mean, one thing that I would agree with what Datesh said previously was that we cannot afford to now put all our eggs in one basket, especially in the region. When it comes to the region, for example, I think the biggest part of that, I think, would be to kind of rebalance our relationship with Iran as well, right? Because I think that has become sort of a casualty in recent years when it comes to, I mean, a lot of Western commentators don't like to, of course, agree or necessarily suggest that, yeah, in India was pressured, but let's be honest, India was pressured into downgrading to a certain extent with the Iranian government, its relationship, whether it's on the trade front, the commercial front, or elsewhere. So in that sense, I would definitely agree that there was so many things that we could have done differently. But I think to some extent, a lot of people are, seeing this as a victory for Pakistan, and there of course has been some, triumphalism, etc. But I would say that we should hold back our horses in the sense that I don't think it's going to be as easy as of a ride for Pakistan or other powers who are there in the region. I think it's going to be a little more difficult. For example, everybody assumes that, okay, there you have Afghanistan. Now China is going to come with the cash bags and everything's going to be fine. I don't think it's going to be as easy as it sounds. So in that sense, I mean, for example, if we talk about, let's say, the CPEC, right? There have been talks in the recent few weeks, etc. China pledging some aid, even the special envoy for Afghanistan from Beijing, he also suggested that we will be giving some money. But again, as the American experience, if one thing that you can take away from it, that throwing money at the problem is not going to solve it. Especially when you have so many divisions in the Taliban government, if you can call it that. So I would say that the situation is evolving very fast. There's a lot of churning happening, and I would say that right now, India should be focusing on, or at least for now, should be focusing on rebalancing and kind of engaging with Central Asian countries, Iran, for example, and also at the same time diplomatically speak a little louder. I mean, recently, we all like to, of course, say that India has done its bit at the UNSC, etc. But I would say that India has been quite reserved while talking about, the current government or the current establishment in Pakistan, and its influence in Afghanistan as well. So all these things I think can be done more. But yeah, of course, there's so much there to be said. Thank you.
Indeed. So let us proceed with the further portions of the discussion. And this is something which is very interesting. So we'll do a little bit faster than before. Because now we discussed the historical part, we discussed the issues of symbolism, and of course the Indo-US considerations in Afghanistan. So we have effectively discussed the historical portion for the viewers. So let us understand a few dynamic issues. Now, recently, we all talk about the India included US led Quad, which is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which now is the Quadrilateral, let us say. But there is one more Quad which has actually emerged, kind of a diplomatic forum, as the State Department of the US had already made it clear recently on 16th of July 2021, which is between the United States, Afghanistan. Ironically, in July it happened, 1 month before the mess happened. So United States, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan in principle agreed to form a new quadrilateral diplomatic forum. The Biden administration had announced it anyways. So the same was formed with an angle to, this is my proposition, to give some particular leverage to Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Now, ironically, there are two conflicting aspects with respect to the geopolitical rush which are emerging. And I would like to ask all the panelists their views. Colonel Patrick can give his views whenever he wishes to. But yeah, question is quite simple. Now, the Chinese think that if in future, by chance, if Taliban gains monopoly of violence, which is again very uncertain to see for now, if let us assume they do, the Chinese wish to expand their BRI initiative. That is one proposition to basically counter India and gain their impetus economically per se, which is their BRI program, the Belt and Road Initiative. The second one is the Pakistani approach, which is fine, okay. Let us increase our conflict economy in Afghanistan, which is what they wish to do, particularly for now, and then gain their footprints in Central Asia and make a particular grouping altogether, geopolitically speaking, also from a geographical perspective. So these two competing perspectives have been, from a risk point of view, proposed, and I found them. So this is particularly I'm putting up on the plate for everyone. Herein, as Datteshji very interestingly pointed out, that now India is engaging a lot with several powers across the globe. In fact, we must understand that I think Minister Jaishankar met Sergei Lavrov recently, I think for the SCO summit, and in Dushanbe. And even India has been engaging with Iran for a while now. In Iran's role in this conflict is quite interesting. So I'll start with Datteshji first, and then Shantiji can follow up on that, and then Rishabh and Shaunak can give their views, and then Colonel Patrick can explain. So my specific question, since I've made the background now, is that since these disruptions are already happening and there are two forums of conflict which are being understood on proposition that, okay, there's one BRI thing and there's this Pakistan thing, which could be considered more credible, or let us say more influential, and between this, does it make sense to say that Afghanistan will gain some sort of monopoly of violence, considering the situation in the Panjshir Valley? And on the Panjshir Valley, Shaunak can give his view specifically, and of course the panelists can give a follow-up, because this is something which has been emerging, and BRI is something which people have been discussing as a matter of rhetoric, but let's discuss them in the most practical terms. So Datteshji, you can begin, Shantiji can give a follow-up, Rishabh can then give a follow-up, and then Shaunak can speak in. I'll try to connect with Colonel Patrick in a while then. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, when you look at China's strategy in the region, quite clearly, I think connectivity and commerce is going to move quite concurrently. Because just put it in the larger context, I mean, what's happened over the last, let's say, a year or so, year and 18 months? Quite clearly, China has indicated that the access to the Middle East through their belt is also a very important component of their larger geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geostrategic connectivity. And while they've struck these strategic partnerships concurrently with UAE and the Middle East, and of course Saudi Arabia, they've also gone in and made a 25-year commitment for $400 billion of infrastructure corridor investment all across Iran. Now, that clearly brings Iran and mainstreams Iran at the bottom end of the Indian Ocean very much into the larger scheme of China's Belt initiatives. But I think what China is looking in this region is connectivity to the Indian Ocean, obviously, but also to be able to create a cordon sanitaire against India in the Eurasian landmass. Because clearly, while there is a quad that is operating in the maritime expanse that seeks to hold China honest in these choke points, China also is using the likes of Pakistan and potentially Turkey, potentially Iran, these countries with whom India either has a strained relationship or a difficult relationship, to be able to build a connectivity cordon sanitaire which can keep India out of Eurasia. Quite clearly, India's economic ties with Central Asia are always going to be minimal, because you clearly know that if you don't have connectivity, no matter what the economic potential may be, you're not going to be able to harness the value of that economic potential. But the point remains that connectivity enterprises that go east-west from Western China all the way, to the western part of the Middle East, clearly is going to have existential implications, not just for India's connectivity to Central Asia, but the larger Indian connectivity, what is called as the International North-South Transport Corridor. I think that is something that gets called into serious question now, because you have Turkey at the northern end, you have Iran at the southern end, you now have Afghanistan where you don't have traction, and that really makes your INSTC extremely fragile in the larger context of India's Eurasian play. So that's the first point. The second is, whenever, and I've had the opportunity of speaking to some senior, Chinese officials at different forums internationally over the last 2-3 years, and whenever I pop the question about the CPEC, it's been very, kind of conspicuous to discern that they understand that the CPEC at some level will also be a black hole. They in fact acknowledge that yes, to some extent, it's an abyss. We are putting a lot of money in there, $64 billion of commitment. They expect a lot of that money not to get recouped back. But they are also very brazen and brash to say that we are still going to stay the course, because for us, what is important is to be able to, as you said, use Pakistan to basically pinprick India and to complicate the entire, western frontier of India. So a lot of this strategy, in fact, recently the special envoy of China, in an interview just last week when he was asked, does India have a role to play? He was very blunt in saying India is not a neighbor of Afghanistan. So clearly the Chinese stack is very visible here. They don't see India as a neighbor, neither geopolitical, neither geoeconomic, not even geocivilizational. So that was kind of shutting India out of that debate from the Chinese point of view. But I would like to raise a larger issue of what you mentioned about also, the commerce. And this, I think, again, is something that the West has to look at very carefully. Whenever the West intervenes in countries, and there are parallels between Iraq and Afghanistan, it is a security-heavy approach. It is almost a security-only approach. The West has almost lost the ability to remain an economic change agent in these places where they intervene. So today, if you look at Iraq, what is it that America did from an economic standpoint to be able to bring stability to Iraq? It was always a case of troop surge. It was putting troops over troops over troops over troops, and then the withdrawal, which happened very messily, that led to the Islamic State being created. Similarly, in Afghanistan, the inability of Western powers to be able to be the economic change agent in Afghanistan is also coming back to roost. And where I think China could be different, of course, things are fluid, things are flux, and we're all doing crystal ball gazing. But where China may be different is in being able to balance a security commitment to the Taliban, presuming Taliban continues in power for a long time, with an economic component and economic strategy that allows Taliban to consolidate power and also allows ordinary Afghans to see a certain economic aspiration being met. Let's say if resources get unlocked, then potentially they may be able to create some goodwill, even though that goodwill is going to be largely driven towards China's requirements. They may be able to create goodwill, which unfortunately America and other Western powers were not able to do. And that's why I kind of yield my comment by saying it's very instructive to hear Foreign Minister Wang Yi, albeit very patronizingly speaking, when he says that we will be the global power who will have learned not only from the Soviet Union, but also have learned from the missteps of the United States. And he points out not just in terms of America's wasteful treasure in a security heavy approach, but also speaks to the fact that there needs to be a balance between a security commitment and an economic change agent commitment. Thank you.
Great. Shantiji, you can give your follow-up. Yeah.
I think the Colonel wants to make a point. I saw him raise his hand.
Okay. Okay, so sure, Colonel Patrick.
Thank you so much, Shanti. Thank you for letting me butt in front of you. Right? Ladies first, forgive me being ungallant. I'm going to be very brief because I've got to leave you in a moment. But I would say this, please, and I don't mean for one moment to be patronizing, quite clearly and quite properly, what I have heard over the past hour or so has come from the Indian perspective. Of course it has. Of course it has. I respect that hugely. I also believe that there is an elephant in the room, if I can use that phrase advisedly, in terms of Indian and Pakistani relationships, which are, of course, extremely difficult, extremely sensitive, and from a Western point of view, not properly understood. But if I can say this as my parting shot, please don't ever believe that the Western alliance will ever again get involved in a meaningful way in trying to sort out the regions of Afghanistan and the region about which we are talking at the moment. The phrases which I don't think have been used enough are appetite, risk aversion, Iraq, and most importantly, Vietnam, as the lessons and the shadows and the horrors which are cast long over Western policy in this sort of region. Datesh made the point, I thought brilliantly, about a security-heavy approach that is being taken or has been taken by the West. But please understand, there is no more appetite in the West for Western blood to be shed over matters that do not directly affect them. The attacks on the Twin Towers are now 20 years ago. Many, many people have forgotten those. What we have not forgotten, or what I do not include myself, I hope, in this equation, but what has been forgotten in the West is the fact that the safety of the West depends heavily and intimately upon what goes on in your region. That does not mean to say that the West is willing to get involved in a military or even a wider security engagement inside the area. The West is now completely 100% involved in looking after its own problems, with democracies which have run their course, which are no longer functioning as democracies, and with problems that we have got out of proportion, for instance, the COVID-19 problem, which has been grossly exaggerated inside the West for whatever reasons. I hate to say it, ladies and gentlemen, but in the future, you must understand, please, that particularly with a democratic president, risk-averse, who is looking entirely internally at his events inside America, then I'm afraid you're on your own.
Thank you, Colonel. I think I'll take it from there. Very interesting point. But I guess the Democrat president would still be looking at China, because it's something I think the US can't ignore. And therein, I think we still have some role to play in terms of the Indo-Pacific Quad and what happens in Afghanistan, because we see China stepping in, and herein I think I'll just get into the China's role in Afghanistan. So it's very interesting to know that China has which had invested hugely in Afghanistan in terms of its economic interests, is now getting into a security trap. And I think herein, I hope China has learned the lessons from both the Soviet Union and America. But having said that, I think it might be following the steps which it's not really thought about very carefully. For instance, if it's looking at engaging the Taliban, which has been doing from the 1990s, and even now, we have to look at the Taliban movement a little bit closely in terms of understanding this organization, which is not really a monolith organization, and there are divisions within. So, any kind of engagement with the Taliban at this point of time would not actually bear any fruition. I think that's one more area we need to look at when we're looking at the whole debate about whether we should engage or recognize the Taliban. Secondly, I think China would, as we pointed out, looking at its larger West Asia and Iranian interest, particularly with the oil and the BRI, would actually go ahead with doing what it's doing in Afghanistan, and also have a strategic counterpoint for India with its alliance with Pakistan. I think therein, I think it definitely has a strategic advantage. But what is worrisome is looking at the neighborhood and how India is kind of isolated despite the engagements which are now picking up. I mean, these were there before, but somehow India seemed to have missed the regional connect, which was very essential, because one of the reasons India had invested in Afghanistan was for its Central Asia policy, where Afghanistan was a land bridge. Historically, it was a buffer. Now we looked at it as a land bridge connecting Central Asia with South Asia. So I think we need to have a vigorous regional diplomacy now. And more importantly, I think we have to look at the role India plays at the UN Security Council. Interestingly, India was the chair when things were unfolding in Afghanistan, and we saw the capture of power by a terrorist group, and India just again went with what the major powers wanted it to do. And we're also seeing that scenario repeat in terms of the sanctions regime and the delisting and the accreditation, which is occurring. I guess if India doesn't use its position in the UNSC well enough now in terms of building certain leverage or counter to what's happening in terms of the West or the international community's recognition of Taliban, I think we'll lose Afghanistan forever. One incident is when you mentioned about Panjshir, is to understand that there was a legitimate caretaker president, Amrullah Saleh, who had built up certain resistance. And I mean, other than supporting them, which India had done traditionally, India could have taken it up on the international stage when Pakistan was actually bombing that area. And it was an outright genocide kind of a scenario. And I think India again lost that plot or opportunity where it could have built a leverage inside Afghanistan and use it as a counterpoint or a pressure point to see that there is some kind of inclusive government the Taliban would adhere to. And what we see now is a complete capture of power, and more importantly, by hardline elements like the Haqqani network. And these groups are closely and very well connected with international terrorist groups, which is just not a concern for India, but for the West. So I think I'll stop there, but if there are more questions or more points, we can take that. But I think we need to understand that Taliban, as we are talking now, is a very different entity, and things are changing very dramatically inside Afghanistan, in the region, and Indian diplomacy has to play a more proactive role rather than the wait and watch policy.
Indeed. So we will be proceeding with the final two portions of this discussion, and I would like to have Rishabh to give his views on the dynamics. Now, as Colonel Patrick is not in the panel anymore, before going, he just gave some amazing views in the end. But so before I ask Shaunak his specific views on the BRI project and how China is dreaming to link it with Iran and other regions, Rishabh, what's your take on this particular conundrum?
One thing I would like to point out with regards to China is that, see, ultimately the concern that we all share. I mean, this is one thing I think we have in common. Although I guess again, it all depends on what is the strategy. But ultimately, the concern that China has, of course, is that Afghanistan should not be used as a base for terrorism against China, especially the East Turkestan movement, etc. But apart from the talking points that it has come out in the recent days with regards to peace and reconciliation, etc., etc., there have been in fact actually calls by the Chinese for the US to redress or even compensate for its actions in Afghanistan, which of course might have been today actually have been forwarded or agreed upon by Russia as well. with regards to BRI, see, first of all, anybody who has studied BRI knows, for example, how important China-Pakistan economic corridor is. And again, this is not something which is coming out of an Indian obsession or something. I've studied or I have interest in CPEC, and I understand that the fact that the whole China's economic project, so to say, hinges upon CPEC and its development, right? And when we are talking about China's approach to Afghanistan, especially the commercial approach, its approach to Pakistan and CPEC is very important. Now, in recent weeks, for example, I think towards end of August or mid-August, the special envoy to Afghanistan, Beijing special envoy to Afghanistan, he said this. He said that, referring to CPEC, he said, sharing benefits while talking, we will share benefits of CPEC in Afghanistan while talking to his counterparts in Pakistan. Now, again, it's not so straightforward. I mean, if you look at the security situation in Pakistan, even before the withdrawal happened, it was not very stable. You had attacks happening at the Dasu hydroelectrical project, for example, in Pakistan, right? The investment, if you look at the investment of CPEC now, right, in the last few years, it has actually gone down. Because the second phase of the whole China-Pakistan economic corridor is much more about not just not just energy projects, etc., but overall in general there has been a very dramatic decrease in terms of investment. So recently you also have the slowing down, as some people suggest. So there is a similar assumption being made about how China will approach Afghanistan. I will say one thing, that a lot of people are assuming that China's approach is one where it does not actually factor in the profit and loss, right? And although I would say that to some extent that could have, I mean, that there was a very good argument, or a argument that had was a genuine argument in Pakistan or certain aspects of CPEC. I don't think that's going to be the case in China, in Afghanistan. So apart from that, the challenge for China would be, of course, to navigate the political dynamics and faction within the Afghanistan. And for that, of course, it will either rely on Pakistan, or it will directly engage. Another test, I think, for China is one thing which I think it's very important. China has always, remember, sold itself as as a very benign country which does not interfere in others' country politics. And I think this is something which it sells itself a bit differently than the Western powers. So it tries, for example, to say that we are a very non-interfering, benign partner, and this is our approach. It's very distinct and different from the West, right? And I think that's going to be tested when the Chinese actually interact with the Afghan partners. So to prove this distinction, right, is going to be important, and I don't think it's going to be as easy, because it will have to match its rhetoric and the practice that it's going to do in Afghanistan. Again, one last point before I hand on the mic is that how Taliban is perceived by the world is also very important, because if that does not change, Chinese interaction will be affected. Because China, remember, will also face a challenge in terms of its own reputation or image, which is very important to the Chinese. I mean, recently reports have emerged, and people who study Chinese social media have actually suggested that a lot of people, and again, I don't mean to overstate this as a factor, but a lot of people in China are actually very critical of the Chinese engagement with the Taliban, right? Although it may be not be, it definitely is not a big factor in terms of how the Chinese government interacts, but it is a factor. So it cannot be too critical. It cannot be too, ambivalence. It can't ignore all these things that are happening in Afghanistan as well. And one more thing on security, right? See, despite Taliban's assurances, it still, I think, remains nervous post the withdrawal. I think there was a similar belief in the early 2000s, where that Chinese project will have a protected status in Afghanistan. I don't think that's true, because I mean, if somebody will remember here, that in 2004 there was an attack on a World Bank sponsored project where there were Chinese workers as well. I think it was in Kunduz, where 11 Chinese workers died. And again, there was a sense of realization in the Chinese that even with assurances from the Quetta Shura or Taliban or ISI, there couldn't be a definitive guarantee provided to them against attacks. And so even with all these, there was a realization that even with all of its ducks seemingly in a row, there was a realization that an attack or the threats does not go down, the security threats. And I think from that perspective, we need to sort of recalibrate or reassess how much China is willing to invest in Afghanistan for now, right? And that I think is a very important part when we talk about the BRI, etc., because it's not going to be as easy as some people are suggesting. And one more thing, which I think Colonel Patrick said before he left, he was very right in saying that there is a loss of appetite. But I would say that again, what the West and especially the US policy is in Afghanistan really matters is because of the elephant in the room. I would say in this point is Pakistan, right? People are still selling the whole, oh, you need Pakistan for over the horizon capabilities, etc. What will you do without us? And I don't mean this as just a Indian jab, right? Coming from the Indian, I think this is very important because ultimately what the policy is towards Pakistan ultimately affects Afghanistan, right? And last time it didn't work out so well. We'll see what happens in the future.
Definitely. So, Shaunak, how do you see the very construct about the very pipeline that China is proposing from Iran to Tibet, and of course you can also take a look at China's BRI initiative from a perspective that they want to expand to Turkey, they would want to expand to Eastern Europe, they want to have their influence in Central Asia economically. Of course, Afghanistan is one of the assumed drivers for China. So, how much mythical or how much realist do you see from an geo-economic point of view? So, what do you think?
Thanks. So let me address the oil pipeline first, because I believe I've written about it earlier. If China wants to build an oil pipeline from Iran to, say, Tibet or Xinjiang, that oil pipeline will be more than 3,000 kilometers long, but that's not the problem. The problem is it will go from around 900 meters above sea level to more than 6,500 meters above sea level. The tallest pipeline in terms of altitude in the world is a gas pipeline at 4,500 meters. So you're talking about an engineering project that has not been attempted before, is immensely costly. If it's an oil pipeline, they'll probably need to utilize a lot of energy to keep the oil flowing, obviously. Plus, it passes through a very sensitive, geologically unstable region, not to mention the security challenges. And all this for what? They're getting a lot of oil and gas from Kazakhstan. They're getting it from Turkmenistan. Russia is providing them as much oil and gas as they need at very competitive rates without any of the headaches that an oil pipeline passing through Taliban-controlled territories brings with it. So what is the sense, economic or otherwise, in building an oil pipeline right there? And if they absolutely are desperate for Iranian oil or gas, they can build it from Iran through Turkmenistan, right? All the way to Xinjiang. They don't have to touch Afghanistan for that. It's a headache that it'll be like chopping your leg off with an axe, literally, because they don't need it. So as far as oil and gas is concerned, I don't trust those theories. They don't make sense to me from an economic point of view or from a security point of view. As far as trade is concerned, again, why do they need Afghanistan? They've got CPEC, which gives them a warm water port in the Indian Ocean / Arabian Sea. They've got all the infrastructure in place or being built. They've already committed $30 odd billion. Rather, they've delivered $30 odd billion. Although now it's really slowing down because Pakistan is realizing the cost of signing up for CPEC, where the Chinese expect return on capital employed of more than 35%. The Pakistanis are unable to repay whatever money is owed to China right now. Forget about any more investments. So they have that infrastructure in place as far as trade is concerned, and it works for them. Why would they go about building something through Afghanistan, a region which has been unstable for 40 odd years, and which incidentally is not stable right now, even with the Taliban in place, because there are factions within the Taliban, there are factional struggles within the Taliban right now. You have the Southern Taliban and you have the Haqqanis. And as Lieutenant General Faiz Hamid's visit to Kabul, unannounced and apparently without General Headquarters permission, shows us, that factional struggle is far from settled. Uh, it's not a settled issue. So I don't think the Chinese are going to venture or jump with both feet into Afghanistan right now. They're just going to wait and watch. They'll make a lot of promises. They'll make huge. They'll throw around huge numbers and probably invest a very small amount, assuming that it's going to be written off.
Indeed. So now I have 2 points to make in because these are the 2 points we will be discussing as the discussion is coming to a conclusive end in maybe some time. So it is being stated in a vociferous way that the withdrawal of the United States Army from Afghanistan was considered to be catastrophic. Indeed, it was very much a failure from a logistical point of view. Some people, that it is an administration-centric failure. Some people say, I'm not saying it, some people say Trump might have done it better, or Trump might have failed, or Biden has definitely failed it. It is Biden's administration's fault. Let's assume that for a while. Even taking that ground for a while, considering the whatever proxy cooperative relationship between US and Pakistan also, because to an extent they also have a role, and the so-called cooperation, or let's say engagement, that the American government and Taliban are trying to have, because many things are happening which are from a policy perspective uncertain, unclear, very irresponsible. In fact, the US, I think the Pentagon just recently stated that the attacks that they did, when they wrongly stated that they were terrorists just a week ago or so, they were not terrorists. Basically, they were civilians, including children, which is again very saddening. So yes, the withdrawal was very, very harmful, but there have been very cross debates on this issue that, everybody says, okay, fine, credibility is gone, that reputation is gone, fine. From a humanitarian perspective, the US has lost its face. Same to some extent, European countries also are, suffering the brunt. I mean, I remember 2 European countries specifically closed their embassy there. They ran away fast, and they actually blocked their emails so that nobody from Afghanistan could actually even connect to them for visa considerations, etc., etc. Meanwhile, a few countries like India tried to do their best on that. In fact, India's approach of withdrawal and even getting, Indian nationals and so forth have been more or less fine. I'm not saying perfect, more or less fine. On the visa issues, I think there's a very interesting thread by Constantino Xavier on Twitter. If people have a look at the thread on, the approach. But fine, that is up to India's refugee policy, and then all of that legal issues with the Indian constitutions and so forth comes in. But I'm not going to on the legal part of it. But still, let's consider from a point of real impact, not just geopolitically, but also on the US itself, which claims to be the leader of the free world, a Cold War phrase I'm talking about, and so forth. Does it really impact? Because after the AUKUS has come into being, which has been accepted by the Anglophone countries such as the UK, Australia, and the United States, France is disappointed, ironically, and we can see some very funny comments from the French ambassadors and other people on Twitter. But leaving that aside, considering the AUKUS and this withdrawal together, do we really see, as some people say, I remember a very interesting article on Spectator, which was regarding a grand strategy by the Anglophone countries. Do we really see a grand plan by the US, and which is, permeating from administration to administration by the Pentagon, or it is indeed something which is going to be catastrophically, really bad? So, Shonak, if you wish to take it up first, I will definitely give it to you. Just 1 point more to add because I forgot it. And should we dissect it in a way that, okay, in hard power it is different, but in soft power it will be catastrophically very different? Because it could be. This is my assumption. But again, this is my question. So we can start with Shaunak, then Datesh ji can continue, and then Shanti ji can give her views, and then Rishabh can proceed. So Shaunak, you go ahead.
So I just wanted to bring up a statement that Zia-ul Haq had made in the early 1980s to, I believe, a British envoy. He said, being the United States ally is like living on the banks of an enormous river. The soil is fertile, there's plenty of water, but every 4 or 8 years, the river changes course and you just might find yourself living in the desert all alone. I think that's kind of pertinent over here in terms of U.S. grand strategy, because it appears to shift significantly with the political dispensation in power. I'll hand it over to the rest of the panelists for now.
Sure. So Datesh ji, what do you think?
Yeah, actually, one of the fallouts that we have to also consider as to what has happened in Afghanistan is at a broader systemic and structural level. And that is one of the most important, I think, propositions going forward that will be impactful. It has only reinforced both the perception and the expectation of a kind of American decline and a Chinese primacy that is coming up. It's always said in international relations that the influence of a nation, a major power, is often the function of how it squares the equation between perception and expectations. And there is a perception crisis that the Americans are in decline. We can quibble over what is decline, what is not decline. Is it stagnation? Is it not decline? Is it pivoting away? These are all quibbles we can have. The bottom line is America today is confessing that they have to retrench from one part of the world to be able to repivot to another part of the world. And Biden administration makes it clear that we are retrenching from what we see as both Central Asia or Eurasia and the Middle East. Let's not forget the Middle East. In fact, the retrenchment of the United States and the eroding of its salience in the Middle East has been in many ways the beginning of the decline of the United States. It's just that in the Middle East, you don't see China, but you see Russia playing a larger role. And so you don't see that China-US dialectic. But the kind of confession by the Biden administration that they're pivoting to resources in the Indo-Pacific, I think is a clear sign that going forward, there will be huge ramifications for countries if they try and stick it out with the US singularly. I believe that going forward, you're going to have to see a lot more middle power coalitions emerge. It's not going to be a US-centric world, nor is it going to be a China-centric world. The center of gravity is going to be somewhere in between. And who will determine that center of gravity, I think, is going to be middle powers. So how India crafts, rather than getting into things like Asian NATO, etc., whether Quad can become an Asian NATO, I think these are sterile, infructuous debates. The bigger debate would be what kind of middle power coalitions India's diplomatic legwork can craft so that we can actually extract the best bang for the buck without necessarily casting our lot with one major power or the other. Because I'll just make this point. We were talking a little bit about the Eurasian alignment and the Indo-Pacific. If you see very carefully, the Eurasian dominant powers, which is China and Russia, willy-nilly, both of them have an Indo-Pacific narrative within their strategic calculus. They may not call it the Indo-Pacific, but they have a strategic calculus in the Indo-Pacific. The Russians keep saying we don't accept the construct, but they do everything which indicates that they are in the Indo-Pacific without accepting the notion of an Indo-Pacific. Similarly, the Indo-Pacific countries, if they want to be relevant both individually and collectively, will also have to find a Eurasian strategy for themselves. It cannot be only a maritime-only domain, because otherwise, going forward, even if the Western powers don't want to be in this region being dominated almost overwhelmingly by Russia and China is going to come back to haunt Western powers and larger democracies, because the spillover will be felt in Europe, the spillover will be felt in the Middle East, the spillover will be felt in Africa, and by extension, the spillover will be felt in the Western Indian Ocean also. And that's why I think the larger systemic implications of this, rise of China versus the decline of America is something that is asking countries like India to become a lot more nimble and supple in its diplomacy. Get off this, kind of fence all the time, sitting and staying risk averse, because you're going to have to make strategic choices. So I think maybe Afghanistan situation may be a blessing in disguise, because in the last 3 weeks, I've seen Indian foreign policy, in a sense, energized like I've never seen before in probably many years. The way in which India is reaching out to various capitals. As we speak, the Saudi foreign minister is due in Delhi for meetings with both our foreign minister and the prime minister. So we are engaging Saudi Arabia, we're engaging Iran, we're engaging Russia, we're engaging through the SCO, we're engaging through the CSTO. We are probably doing what we need to do on an enduring basis to be able to carve out our own niche within this larger dialectic of America's decline and China's primacy. Thank you.
Yes, Shantaji, please give your follow-up. Yeah.
Are you waiting? Sorry.
So sorry. Yes. Please go. You can go ahead with the follow-up. I'm so sorry. I'm extremely sorry.
No, it's okay. I just had a problem with some internet connection, right? And I got to leave. So broadly speaking, I think the question you fundamentally raised about the US approach and whether the US military intervention and the security approach they adopted in a way impacted on the American power, and also about how it unfolded in Afghanistan. I think we need to take cognizance of the fact that initially when US intervened in Afghanistan in 2001, it was highly inadequate in numbers, in number of troops and resources compared to other conflict theaters like Iraq, Bosnia, Kosovo. I think the troop numbers were very insufficient, and therein there was a space provided by which the Taliban could re-emerge. And the Bush administration's attention, which was more focused on Iraq, they have changed the tide of war in Afghanistan. So I think when you look at the military strategy of the US, you need to look at how it unfolded from 2001 till now. So Bush went in for a very limited counterterrorism approach with more focus on Iraq and a lot of aversion to nation building. So they didn't do initially what they should have done in building the local capacities of the Afghan government. And thereafter, we did see during Obama administration that there was a kind of a justification of fighting a just war, and thereby they announced a troop surge. And this coincidentally was announced with an exit, and which played to the advantage of the Taliban. And what we saw from Obama administration and Trump administration and now Biden administration is always this hurry to exit, and most of it was based on the American political calendar rather than Afghan needs. And herein, I think we have huge lessons in terms of understanding US interventions in countries like Afghanistan were very limited in their goal and didn't have a clear vision of what the end state is. And this withdrawal, as you saw, about how it unfolded in the month of August, had a lot of parallels to what happened in Saigon. And in that last Saigon moment, you had lessons to be learned in terms of how military interventions are very limited in terms of achieving the political objectives. And the second question is when actually they were building an Afghan army, they were also signing a peace agreement with the Taliban, and the Afghan army was asked not to fight the Taliban. And thereby you can actually not blame the Afghan army for the collapse which occurred. And that is a second lesson when you're looking at in terms of building the local capacities and security sector. And broadly looking at the contours and the dynamics as they're emerging, I think I agree with the idea that we are not really looking at a bipolar order or a hegemonic order, but more in terms of emerging multipolarity. And thereby, I think India has to look out for partners. The last 2 decades in Afghanistan is clearly an important lesson for India in terms of slanting towards one power and going the American way in many sense than it should have, because India did had leverages in Afghanistan which it didn't clearly use. And the fact that when peace agreement was signed in Doha, and from the fact that from 2014 till now, there were periodic announcements by the US presidents of exit, India should have been well prepared. But having said that, I think India needs to play a more important role on the international level, and those forums are very much available, right from the UN to other areas of looking at how it can involve itself in humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan, and also building a campaign to protect the rights of the women and minorities inside the country. it can do a lot in terms of regional diplomacy, but a more concerted effort on an international level is required, because what's unfolding in Afghanistan is catastrophic, just not for the Afghans, but also for the region and for India. I think I'd like to stop there, and I think I'd like to leave now. So thank you for your time, and thanks for having me on a great discussion. Thank you.
Certainly grateful to have you, ma'am. And really, in future, we'll have you in more discussions regarding. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
So, as we are left with the final part of the discussion, let us wrap it up fast with the concluding remarks. I believe the panelists who left already have given their concluding remarks. So, in a nutshell, I actually was expecting Brigadier Ben Barry to be also here to discuss the perspective of the Americans, the Atlantic partners, basically the US and the UK, more on this, because there is some very interesting literature which is now emerging, few blogs I would say, but really interesting policy critiques that on the grand plan and so forth. But to end this on a quite, let's say, optimistic note, that we had a good discussion, not on the situation, of course. How should we conclude on the current developments? And I am now pinpointing out to the role of Pakistan and the current developments in relation with Iran's strategic moves. How should we see that forth? And within that, the panelists in the clockwise manner can give their concluding remarks. So, Tejji, you can proceed. Then Rishabh, you can do so, and Shaunak, you can give your concluding remarks. Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Abhivardhan. First thing that I'll say is, as far as America's withdrawal was concerned, there was some kind of a regional consensus that America needed to go. So the vacation from Afghanistan had a regional consensus. But what you now find is there is no consensus on what should supplant the United States, or what kind of a structure must emerge. And I think this fluidity and flux situation creates both vulnerabilities but also creates opportunities. Now, in this vulnerability opportunity kind of dialectic, what makes this situation more complicated or fascinating, take whichever word you want to take, is the angularities that are involved in the region. For example, you referred to Pakistan and Iran. While Iran and Pakistan are not on the same page as far as Taliban ensconcing itself in Kabul is concerned, we also saw that when the ISI chief called the meeting of intelligence chiefs, you actually had Iran's intelligence chief participate in that meeting. So it clearly tells you that nobody is an untouchable and nothing is taboo right now in this kind of a situation, except for the fact that the Americans don't need to have any role there. I think in this kind of a situation, you will have to be extremely flexible in what kind of an approach that one takes. Pakistan's role, Pakistan's strategic depth is here to start. Dr. C. Rajamohan's concept, which he floated when he was asked about this whole notion of will the Pakistan-China, kind of axis actually be able to do anything different. He had this whole notion of the Sipahi and the Saukar. I would like to add three things here. There is the Sipahi of Pakistan who will basically carry the can and do the dirty job. You have the Saukar, which is China, which will look at mercantilist approach in Afghanistan and maintain a very kind of a transactional approach. And then you have the overall strategy laden of Turkey. And I keep going back to Turkey because I think this particular country is going to be the X factor. Because Erdogan has clearly made it, his priority that he wants to build a larger Turkic council, as he calls it. He looks at Central Asian countries and the Caucasus as being very much part of their backyard. So what you're seeing is the graveyard of the empires will now evolve into competitive confluence of backyards. There is a Russian backyard that Russia wants to recapture because Russian relevance is at stake here. There is China creating its own backyard or an extension frontier through connectivity. There is Turkey, which looks at this backyard in terms of growing what they would like to see as a larger Turkish influence caliphate. And there is Iran, of course, which does believe it's a regional power which has influence in this region. So any kind of a framework that is going to emerge, I think, is going to be some kind of a give and take between these four competitive backyards that are going to emerge. And India, not being a direct contiguous neighbor of Afghanistan, cannot have really a fifth backyard. India will have to manage between these four backyards and find where its bang for the buck is. So I think this, I would conclude with this kind of a framework for the next few years in terms of Afghanistan and the larger region. Thank you.
Rishabh, you can conclude. Yeah.
Yeah, agree with what Sir just said. And I would just like to add one more point, and I think this is very important. It's something some people have touched upon. Um, and this is regard to, of course, the Indo-Pacific, etc. But now that we're having so many discussions about trilaterals and multilateral deterrence, etc., with AUKUS and Quad and all of that, I think one debate or one discussion or one critique, as I should say, which was a very early one, I would say, when the Indo-Pacific was entering the geostrategic lexicon, right? When we are starting to actually understand what is the Indo-Pacific, um, there was a debate or a challenge. A lot of thinkers actually pointed out that one thing that we have to understand, and that was again, this is a debate again which applied to the Quad coalition as well, that to what extent would our different perceptions or different notions of what actually constitutes the Indo-Pacific is going to become a challenge? Like how much of that is going to be a challenge in terms of how we approach the threats, etc. Now, in the larger debate of about the relevance of the Indo-Pacific and how we have to channel our energies, etc. I think one important thing that India has to look out for, and this is something which Datesh sir has actually touched upon, that to a large extent, a lot of these Western countries look at the Indo-Pacific from a maritime perspective, and Indo-Pacific, in through its initial conception, was actually considered to be replacing Asia-Pacific, which was considered to be a more commercial and land-specific concept. But an important point here is to realize, or is something which India should be very clear at, is that Indo-Pacific does not stop at the Bay of Bengal, right? For India, I mean, if you're talking about the confluence between two seas, right, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, it should not just stop at the Bay of Bengal or near the Malacca Strait, and that's a very important discussion to be had, because if you're looking at the Indo-Pacific, and again, as somebody pointed out earlier, Russia and China have, of course, clear stances against it. I mean, Russia has even called out India on, buying the Cold War Western concept, etc., etc. So my worry is that, and this is something which I think India should focus on, especially with regards to its European and Western partners, is that there should be a very clear understanding of what actually encapsulates and what constitutes the Indo-Pacific and how that approach should be. Because right now, the debate that we're having with regards to AUKUS, etc., is that everybody's interest, right, should be taken into consideration before making any big moves, etc., and all that. So, to what extent does, for example, the United States, the UK, the EU, France, etc., all these countries, what are their approach towards the region, is something that we also have to focus on, right? We have to be very clear in communicating what our interests are, what are our red lines, and of course, don't have to be too rigid about it. But I would say that in that sense, a lot of people, when we're having this discussion about credibility, etc., sort of just forget South Asia or subcontinent as just India, Pakistan, going at each other. I don't think it's that simple, and I think a lot of times India, tends to make it about that, sometimes by design, sometimes by mistake. But in that sense, I would say that India really needs to communicate with the US that there are certain things that needs to happen from their side as well, especially with regards to their AFPAC policy. On second point, again, later in the year, we'll see, for example, the question of the S-400 and the possibility of sanctions being imposed on India. Those kind of frictions will rise. Those again have to be very, very deftly maneuvered, because again, if, for example, there is something punitive or some punitive action taken against India on that front, I think then that will be a very difficult challenge for coalitions like Quad, for example. So overall, I would say that yes, right now the debate that we're having is good, because it does bring up certain difficult conversations which we have avoided as a nation for a very long time. Not just the whole soft power, hard power debate, but also, for example, what Sir touched upon before, the idea that the whole risk averse, sitting on the fence, wait and watch policy may not be be counterproductive, but at some point of time, just being and doing nothing also has certain cost, which may not be immediate in nature, but then again, you see, for example, these costs taking its toll, in the future. So in that sense, I think, as Sir pointed out before, we need to really have very independent policy, which we've had over the last few years, but again, communicate much more on the global scale as to what is happening in Afghanistan. I think we have shied away from that a little bit, unexpectedly. And yeah, and don't be afraid, and don't not be afraid of actually going and setting an independent path when it comes to global forums on these issues. We don't have to toe a certain line, especially when it comes to Afghanistan, because everybody looks at Afghanistan from a very different perspective, right? One of the main reasons America is okay with withdrawing is not just because the war was expensive. It's also because they now assess that the terror threat emanating from the Afghanistan region is not a direct threat to their homeland. And I think that, I mean, again, this is something which we can disagree upon, but I would say that this is not a luxury that we have, right? So in that sense, I would say that we also have to be very clear as to what our expectations of these powers would be in these middle power arrangement, or in, for example, Quad, etc. And yeah, and again, try to ramp up the diplomatic interactions with Central Asian countries, because in the last few years, we've seen China, for example, has even outpaced Russia to a certain extent in these countries, right? So it will be very interesting, and again, not to forget Turkey's role is also very important. But yeah, at the end of the day, I would say that the policy discourse on Afghanistan has to be widened. We don't just have to talk about the what ifs, the counterfactual, what could have been, or whether we should engage with Taliban or not, but also as to how we engage with the world and how we can help Afghanistan in different ways and protect our interests as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, Shaunak, you can give your concluding remarks.
Sure. Professor Parulekar and Vats, they both address the broader picture very neatly. So I'll focus on one particular aspect that we saw a lot of chest beating about with a whole bunch of Pakistani nationals and their commentariat celebrating victory. Let's talk about what they've actually won. They've achieved strategic depth according to their perceptions. But what does that really mean? In the event of an all-out war with India, is Pakistan, specifically GHQ Rawalpindi, going to move one corps into Afghanistan across from Miramshah? They're not going to do that. Their center of gravity is in Punjab. They have to defend it at all costs. So the illusion of strategic depth, it's perhaps it's something that they justify messing about across the Durand line with. But what kind of a victory is it? The second aspect of this victory is, over the past 19 years, they've received more than $32 billion in aid from the United States, military and civilian. That is going to dry up now. So your victory it's not really victory as such. I mean, I saw a commenter liken it to the dog that chases a car, and once the car stops and the dog catches up with it, it doesn't know what to do with it. There's a substantial gap between what strategic depth has been portrayed as and what it actually means for them. The second aspect about this victory is the moment the Taliban overran Bagram, as well as that jail near Kabul, they released a few hundred soldiers of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. These guys have now crossed the Durand line. They're back in Pakistan. And if you've noticed, over the past few weeks, attacks in their areas in Pakistan have gone up on Pakistani security forces. So that's a genie that appears to have been let out of the bottle. Whether they can contain it or not will depend on how the Pakistani state reacts. but it's a headache for them, and it's not all roses. That would be my assessment of their victory over the Western forces. Thank you.
Just to make a small point, I think Shaunak touches upon a very important point, I think, and which is very important from our perspective as well, is that sometimes a lot of commentators in India, for example, have suggested that because whatever their achievement has been, because of what has happened and how Pakistan has managed to set aside India, a lot of people have gone and crouched and put this defeatist that we can't basically do anything. I don't think that should be our approach. I think it's a major setback, no doubt. And yes, there are a lack of options. There are no easy answers as to what we can do, what are our clear policy options. But I don't think we should take it as there's nothing we can do kind of a thing. I do think that to some extent the Pakistan, not just commentators or their establishment, the triumphalism that they have could be short-lived because of the fractures between the Taliban factions and, of course, what happens in the northwest, their northwest, frontiers. So, in that extent, to that extent, I would like to point out that yes, it's a setback, but we should not be looking it as something which is inevitable and there's nothing that we can do about it. I think that would be a problem. That could be a wrong way to look at it.
Great. So with this, I think on a very, very optimistic note from a perspective that we really had a very engaging discussion, we end this special episode of Global Hint Season 2. So we will be coming up with more episodes, book discussions on maybe the Cold War, maybe Afghanistan, maybe the Indo-Pacific, maybe China. It depends. Before this episode I had with Manoj Kevarmani, this episode was on Afghanistan, so something new could be awaited, maybe on Europe. So I'm not making any guesses, but I'm just giving some instances what it could be. Nevertheless, as we end this discussion, I would request the panelists to, of course, stay for 2 minutes for a feedback session as the live broadcast ends. But I would like to say to the viewers that in the coming 2 weeks, we will be releasing the list of the panelists for the Indian Conference on Artificial Intelligence and Law 2021. First edition went pretty well. We had 21 plus speakers last year. This year, we will have also a bunch of very interesting speakers coming through. So as we release a list of the speakers for IndoCon 2021, do await that. And on 17th and 18th of October, Global Law Assembly will be having their first ever conference specifically on the Indo-Pacific, which is the Indo-Pacific Mobility Forum 2021, a 2-day event discussing the legal and policy aspects of the Indo-Pacific from all corners. With this, we end this episode, and thank you so much for watching, and a thank you to those who will be watching us. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel, press the bell icon, as we will come up with new episodes of Indus Thing, Global Hint, AI Now, and Indian Integrals. With this, sayonara, good night, and thank you. Namaste.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.